Well, hello again, and welcome to our second video, which is a little bit of the history of the Reformed tradition as it moves towards its expression in the Presbyterian Church in North America, particularly the Presbyterian Church of the United States of America. If, as Craig Van Gelder and Dwight Zeichel say in their book, Participating in God's Mission, that the Reformation confessions, which are important for this whole Reformed tradition, while theologically consolidating the church, were paralleled by the consolidation taking place culturally and politically in the rise of modern nation states, which led in turn to the formation of state churches. What they say, so that's their quote, and then what they say is that this makes a point that these, what they call Euro-tribal faith traditions that had emerged exercising homogeny as state churches were in fact fundamentally particular and thus not normative or universally applicable for those of us who are shaped by and live in a tradition of these mainline denominations. And so that is the UCC, that's the United Methodist Church, that's certainly the Presbyterian Church USA, it's the Episcopal Church, it's a number of these other denominations that historically have really been more at the center of the way things have been socially and culturally in North America. We call that Christendom or Constantinianism, and we can unpack those terms when we're in class together. They're making a point that our experience of being church is not fundamentally normative, although many of us were shaped by a tradition that put that message to us that was kind of, this is the way it normally is. People from African American church traditions, people from other church traditions that have historically been more of at the margins in America don't share that story, often are surprised when we bring those unconscious expectations to these kinds of experiences. But the Presbyterian Church certainly has, as part of its main strain, an understanding that we are kind of in the center of where things are socially, politically, culturally. So if you go into lots of towns across America, you'll find a First Presbyterian Church, and that First Presbyterian Church will be downtown. It'll be at the center of the town. We're used to inhabiting social space in that way. What, again, back to Van Gelder and Zeisel say, is that evidence of historical particularity of the Euro-tribal faith traditions became manifest when their diverse immigrants began to settle into the British colonies of what eventually became the United States. So I want to go back and walk through some social cultural history of what shaped the Presbyterian expression of the Reformed tradition and see in some ways what that's given us both as gifts and also what I believe are some challenges, and that's what we'll do in this video. So the Presbyterian Church gets its start in Geneva. This happens in the mid-1500s. Around Geneva at that point, Geneva is a small city-state. It would have probably about the geography of Pittsburgh, but not that number of people at all, maybe about 25,000 people. So actually a relatively small population when we think of population sizes these days. It was at the center of political and military battles in the area. That caused factions in the city, conflict around the city, and then refugees that actually streamed into the city. A number of those were from France. John Calvin was from France. Geneva, of course, is in Switzerland. So as he came there and was invited by the city council to be their chief pastor and to guide the church in that area, he found himself in a unique position where there were people coming in from the outside and also high expectations that there'd be kind of a stability there as a lot of moving parts around Geneva. It was a city-state, which meant that it had a city, but also a rural area. There were urban churches and rural churches. There was poverty to consider, both in the city and also around the area. He dealt with politics in a highly aristocratic area. They went from a prince/bishop called a vidame there to what was called the Petit Council, or the Small Council, and the General Council. The Petit Council, the Small Council, made a lot of decisions. They're the ones who appointed pastors. So this is an area where the state is actually making pastoral appointments. Calvin had them and advocated for a shift where congregations got to vote on whether or not they would have the pastor, their first involvement in making those kinds of choices. They didn't search for a pastor. They had someone sent to them, and then they would do an evaluation and vote about that. There was a larger council, this general council, that took care of a lot of the political infrastructure of that area, the buildings of that area. So think, as you're thinking about your own churches and your own experience of being a church leader, that the Reformed tradition in its Presbyterian roots gets its start in an area where the state is supporting the church and where buildings are not a primary concern of pastoral work, where preaching and care of people is, because most of the other stuff is taken care of by other people who are maybe you're interacting with, but you're not leading them in actively considering those types of things. A primary concern in Geneva was communication, particularly who controlled the pulpits. And Calvin advocated for pastoral control of the pulpits. This was the primary communication method in the society. So by controlling the pulpits, Calvin controlled the communication flow of what went out into the city, very different from the world in which we now live. But Calvin could directly criticize political leaders from the pulpit, and as long as he protected that communication from interference by the political structures, he had enormous freedom and leverage and influence into the spiritual life, but also the social, political, and religious institutional life of Geneva. There was in Geneva and in the church in general at that time a focus on church discipline. So people who were outside of the bounds of church action were brought up on trials. There were trials, and people were often sent for additional sermons for small infractions like arguing with their neighbors. So again, think to an area or in an area where there was that kind of social cohesion and capital, and you start to get a picture of the roots of the Reformed tradition. In terms of the structure of the church for Geneva and for Calvin, there were three bodies. There was a body called the consistory, and that was Calvin and elected lay leaders. So these are what we might call lay leaders, and this becomes what the Presbyterian Church calls the session. But it was the Calvin and elected leaders making church decisions. So they were responsible for appointments, for hiring, for firing, and for managing the life of the church. Alongside of that, there was something that they developed called the Company of Pastors, which was Calvin and other pastors. So you can see Calvin as a thread here, but there's Calvin and elected leaders making administrative decisions. There's Calvin and other pastors supporting one another, doing theological work together, training pastors, and in particular, as they worked in a very dynamic environment in terms of theology, they were able to come to often consensus about issues like the Lord's Supper, and election was actually another one, and issue papers or statements that were supported or in support of other city-states. Bern was one of those where people were doing this kind of cohesive and coherent and together theological work. And then there was also, and this is not well known or I think historically publicized, a weekly group called the Congregation, which was Calvin moderating an ongoing Bible study. So it actually happened before the Company of Pastors met. There would be a Bible study. Calvin moderated. He often would lead it, but not always. And he would unpack the scriptures, and then there was a robust conversation. There's even disciplinary cases where people got kind of out of hand in this and weren't able to kind of work and think together. So that's what's going on in Geneva. And then there's international visitors. John Knox, to whom we'll turn next, comes to Geneva out of this robustness comes Calvin's book, The Institute of the Christian Religion, and also the very first Reformed polity, which he developed with his people. From Geneva, the Reformed tradition in its Presbyterian roots ends up in, there's out of this an earthiness to the Reformed tradition, a concern for people, real life. You can hear those concerns. There is an emphasis on doctrine, on thinking correctly. There's a care for people. And there also are significant, what we would now name as mistakes, including the killing of Michael Servetus, who was considered a heretic and was burned in Geneva. So the Reformed tradition in its Presbyterian roots is not clean in the way it develops. There's violence. There's also a robustness as they, in a dynamic way, try to figure out what God is doing, how to participate in what God is doing, and how to be the church in a way that does not have a pope and thus needs new structures to support what's going on, in this case, in concert with the political systems that are there. The next stop is Scotland. John Knox is the main name to know here, but it's not only John Knox. In the mid 1500s, so this is just a little bit behind Calvin. So John Knox goes to Geneva, comes to Scotland, and there's a lot of stories about John Knox. He and some other Johns write a confession called the Confession of 1560. It's one of the first Reformed confessions. It's the first kind of Presbyterian confession. They also are trying to figure out what to do around how to structure the church. They come up with a concept called superintendents. They didn't want bishops, but they wanted some way that they could guide the church. John Knox develops the theology of the church, where actually people start to choose their pastor, not have a pastor sent to them, but actually choose their own pastor. And that stream of the Reformed church develops. And eventually we get presbyteries. Presbyteries are a development out of this company of pastors and also this congregation, which in Scotland became known as the exercise, that people would get together and they would study scripture together fairly robustly. As in Scotland, which was much larger geographically and also in terms of its population, the National Assembly, called the General Assembly, eventually realized they needed to have an intermediary body between themselves and the local congregations because too much business was coming to them. And there's a great phrase in one of their minutes where it says, "The exercise may be judged a presbytery." It's the first time the word presbytery is used, and it comes out of this Bible study, which then gets more responsibilities to guide the church in a particular geography. Scotland adds to us a Reformed church figuring out how to work in a larger area, a more robust consideration of finances, because the church in Scotland was struggling with its finances and trying to figure out how to be a quote-unquote Reformed church, which had monasteries, which had land holdings, but the political leaders did not want to hand them over to the church as they gained independence. Those political leaders were in a struggle both with England and also with France and trying to gain political independence. So there was conflict and conversation there. There is a continued emphasis on theology, and that's an ongoing stream of the Reformed tradition that we want to accurately talk about how we understand who God is, what God is doing, what God's done in Jesus Christ, how we as people can participate in that. And you can hear this beginning of a conversation of who makes decisions. If the church isn't Roman Catholic, if there's not a pope, if there's not bishops, then how do we guide those things? This eventually comes to America through the Scotch-Irish. Poor Scots end up in Ireland, and then they end up in America. James Webb, in a book called Born Fighting, says that the democracy of the Scottish church is in the blood. These people are poor, these people are proud, and these people are, he says, stubborn as hell. And I can tell you, you can go into a lot of Presbyterian churches. There is poverty because there can be some socioeconomic difference. There's not a lot of poverty because of a work ethic and some systemic things, but they're proud and they're stubborn. They do things like sing, drink, pray, fight, work hard, value